In 1986, Dragon Quest had sparked the beginning of a new age of role-playing video games in Japan. Among the multitude of titles that would follow in its wake, the most prolific would be Final Fantasy, which by the early 1990s would effectively become Dragon Quest's biggest rival. But it was in the lead-up to their respective fifth entries in 1992 that their creators, Yuji Horii and Hironobu Sakaguchi, along with famed manga artist Akira Toriyama, would take a business trip to the United States that would lead to the two titans of the genre collaborating on a new RPG. Their goal? To make something that nobody had ever seen before. While the trio were enthusiastic about collaborating on a project together, their respective schedules would make it difficult for them to do more than just hash out ideas for about a year or so. Each of them was neck-deep in their own signature series during this time, with Sakaguchi producing Final Fantasy VI and fulfilling his obligations as Square's vice president, Toriyama writing and illustrating the Boo saga of the Dragon Ball manga, and Horii working on the Super Famicom remakes of the first two Dragon Quest games, as well as Dragon Quest VI. The Dream Team, as they would eventually be known, quickly became aware of the difficulties that were abound with this project before it even truly got off the ground, and they were just about ready to throw in the towel when they were approached by Square designer Kazuhiko Aoki, who offered to produce the game and finally get the ball rolling on development. Aoki had been with the company since its early years, having cut his teeth on Cruise Chaser Blasty in 1986, and worked on combat and gameplay in Final Fantasies III and IV. But while directing an installment of the Hanjuku Hero series, he was also leading the charge on a sequel to Seiken Densetsu Final Fantasy Gaiden, to be released for the then still in development CD-ROM add-on for the Super Famicom. This game, codenamed Maru Island, was also being developed in collaboration with Akira Toriyama, but it would unfortunately be scrapped entirely once the team learned that the CD-ROM add-on was cancelled. From there, it was split into two projects. The first was Seiken Densetsu 2, or Secret of Mana as it would be called outside of Japan, which would be directed by Koichi Ishii and produced by Hiromichi Tanaka. The second was Chrono Trigger. Now with Kazuhiko Aoki as producer, and with Jump editor Kazuhiko Torishima facilitating Horii's temporary release from Enix to work on the project, Sakaguchi, Toriyama, Horii, and Aoki would convene for 4 days to deliberate over ideas for the game. While Horii and Sakaguchi clashed on various aspects of the game's design, as one may expect, they were mostly on the same page regarding their ultimate goal. They sought a synthesis of their disparate ideas, and Horii, being an outsider from Square, brought a new perspective. In the words of Sakaguchi, quote, "Horii is a very quiet person, but I think that's because he is intently observing the people around him. He reads people well, and I think he uses that ability to help in creating his own dramatic scenarios. Things that we at Square normally don't pay much heed to were things that, in contrast, Horii always paid attention to. He gave me a lot to think about. If these were things that Horii was concerned about, then that means players must be too." End quote. They would subsequently gather more developers from within Square to pitch their ideas, as was often the case with the Final Fantasy series. It was during this time that somebody suggested time travel, and, in keeping with wanting to create something new and unique, it was adopted as the game's core motif, with everybody pitching ideas for the story, world, and gameplay that could take advantage of it. Not everybody was so keen on centering the game around escapades through time, however, and among that minority would be the game's story planner, Masato Kato. A relative newcomer to Square, Kato first entered the video game industry as a graphics artist at Tecmo, starting with Captain Tsubasa, or Tecmo Cup soccer game as it would be known in North America. More significant were his contributions to the Ninja Gaiden trilogy, where over time his role would expand from working on visuals alone, to writing the scenario on the second game, and directing action sequences for the third. However, due to the culture of Japanese game publishing at the time, Kato had been forced to adopt a pseudonym for the game's credits, Run Maru. After the completion of Ninja Gaiden 3, Kato would leave Tecmo for Gainax, where he would be assistant director, graphics artist, planner, and scriptwriter for a video game adaptation of the studio's own Nadia, The Secret of Blue Water anime series. He would continue to fulfill these roles, except assistant director, for Princess Maker 2. At the time, Gainax was still a fairly small operation, which Kato, for unspecified reasons, wasn't particularly enthralled with, and so he resolved to find work at a larger, more established developer. It was shortly thereafter that he would join Square, where he was almost immediately thrust into a meeting with dozens of people to share ideas for a new RPG, for which he volunteered to write the scenario, and would end up directing the project as well. Being both new to the company and inexperienced with RPGs, Kato was facing an uphill battle from the very beginning. He had no personal work booth nor computer to work on, so whatever visual concepts he conjured up were done by hand. Upon turning in a sketch for a full-party special attack to Sakaguchi, he was told, quote, "Don't turn in scribbles like this." All the while, he was constantly thinking about what sort of story could only be told through a video game, when the crux of that story was something he felt wasn't a good idea. While he personally adored science fiction and time travel stories, his aversion to making a game focused on time travel boiled down to the belief that it could lead to the game being a repetitive series of errands that would bring down the quality. But that decision was out of his hands, and he had to work with the hand that he'd been dealt. For the first year, Kato would meet with Yuji Horii at his studio for several hours every week to discuss suggestions that the Square staff had pitched to him, and every morning Sakaguchi would assemble the development staff to give him progress reports. Despite Chrono Trigger being primarily born out of a collaboration between the two men, Horii and Sakaguchi's direct involvement in the project after Kazuhiko Aoki stepped up to produce became somewhat tenuous. While both would still supervise development and were credited as such, Sakaguchi was embroiled in his role as vice president of Square and the development of Final Fantasy VI throughout 1993, and Horii, who is a huge fan of time travel stories, particularly the 1966 American TV show, The Time Tunnel, mostly contributed outlines and story beats. Quote,
"As for this game, I'm only involved in the plot. If there's a fairground, I just write that there's a fairground. I don't write down any of the details. Then the staff brainstorm and come up with a variety of attractions to put in."
As for Akira Toriyama, the third pillar of the Dream Team, his involvement hardly extended past concept art and character designs based on rough sketches from Horii, though Kato also had his own sketches. The graphics team ultimately had to learn how to emulate Toriyama's aesthetic and design philosophy for most of their work, aiming to stay faithful to what he would have done while also considering what worked for the various time periods. But while Chrono Trigger's art style would be spearheaded by Dragon Quest's concept artist, its score wouldn't be handled by either Koichi Sugiyama or Nobuo Uematsu. Instead, the task would fall to a sound engineer with aspirations of being a music composer, Yasunori Mitsuda. Having worked on sound effects for Hanjuku Hero, Final Fantasy V, Secret of Mana, and Romancing Saga 2, Mitsuda had grown frustrated at his meager pay that left him struggling to make ends meet. Feeling as though he had no choice, Mitsuda gave Sakaguchi an ultimatum. Quote, "If you're not going to let me create music, then I'm going to quit." In response, Sakaguchi suggested Mitsuda compose for Chrono Trigger, and that his salary may increase afterward. According to Mitsuda, the increase wasn't that big. Unbeknownst to his superiors, however, Mitsuda had been composing songs in secret for the 2 years he had been producing sound effects at Square. Now that he was officially assigned to a project as a composer, he began sifting through these works in order to retroactively apply them to Chrono Trigger wherever appropriate, while also composing new tracks for the project. Mitsuda was a perfectionist when it came to his craft, and would regularly discuss scenes and settings with Masato Kato, with whom he would become close friends, before composing. It wasn't uncommon for him to sequester himself within his studio for days at a time, springing awake when a melody came to him in his sleep and immediately getting to work on it. Mitsuda's unhealthy commitment to his craft would eventually catch up with him when he was hospitalized with stomach ulcers, at which point Nobuo Uematsu stepped in to help supplement the soundtrack. Unfortunately, this was not the end of Chrono Trigger's development woes, because after the completion of Final Fantasy VI, Sakaguchi would give the order to scrap everything and start over from scratch. In 1994, Kazuhiko Torishima took it upon himself to bring a development build of the game to Akira Toriyama at the artist's home. The renowned editor had his own misgivings with what he had been presented, but between his own aversion to confrontation and what he described as the, quote, good personality of the person in charge of the project, though whether this was Aoki or Kato is unclear, he figured that whatever it was couldn't be helped. He took the bullet train to Toriyama's house, but just as he was about to present it to him, Torishima received a distressed phone call from Sakaguchi.
Hello?
Torishima, did you show the game to Toriyama?
No, I was just about to...
Then please take it home right away without showing it to him. This is no good. I'll go in and do it all over from the beginning. I'll do it myself. The details of what this build was like and what pushed Sakaguchi to press the reset button haven't been made clear, but his response spoke volumes. After a few scant months of early pre-production on Final Fantasy VII, Sakaguchi would merge the Final Fantasy team with the Chrono Trigger team, bolstering the size of the team to over 50 people, the largest in Square's history at the time, though it was almost evenly split between experienced developers and first-timers. As part of this consolidation, Masato Kato's directorship would be rescinded, and, likely in an effort to expedite development, divvied up similarly to how it had been for Final Fantasy VI, with Yoshinori Kitase, Akihiko Matsui, and Takashi Tokita stepping in as directors. And true to his word, Sakaguchi became much more actively involved in the day-to-day development, carefully reviewing every scenario as soon as he fully committed himself to the project, and regularly working in the trenches, so to speak, alongside his staff. Tensions were high, the clock was ticking, and along the way development had come to a complete stop when their files suddenly became unreadable. As Kazuhiko Aoki described it, quote, "Our files were saved with a timestamp on them, but for some reason these files had had their date changed to 1960, and the computer couldn't read them. I guess our computer must have known this was the Chrono Trigger project, and decided to do a little time traveling of its own." End quote. One of the biggest concerns, however, was memory. Chrono Trigger was intended to fit on a 24 megabit cartridge, with a major emphasis on graphics as a result of the time travel motif. Moving through history would necessitate aesthetic distinction, from environments to NPC sprites to objects to the various world maps. This was in addition to what Akihiko Matsui described as a, quote, mountain of ideas that were proposed, tested, and subsequently cut. By his estimation, about half of what was in the game's planning documents was completely stricken out. Compounding these concerns was Yuji Horii brushing off anxieties about memory constraints for the sake of dialogue, much to the chagrin of the development staff, including Yoshinori Kitase. When Sakaguchi saw just how much the team had created and how much space it would require, he made the executive decision to bump the game up to a whopping 32 megabit cart, with about 6 of the 8 additional megs being used solely for graphics. The chaos of Chrono Trigger's development would continue to the very end. All the while, V-Jump was pulling out all the stops to promote what many were expecting to be the ultimate RPG. A massive presence at V-Jump Festival 94, showcases on 2 separate promotional videotapes from the event, and plenty of coverage within the magazine's pages, among other publications, going as far back as August of 1994. Anticipation for this collaboration between the 2 biggest titans of the genre was growing rapidly, leaving players chomping at the bit for over half a year before Chrono Trigger was finally released in Japan on March 11th, 1995, and in North America on August 11th that same year. Like Final Fantasy VI, the title screen for Chrono Trigger is positively enrapturing, but its tone is on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. It's spellbinding. From the swinging of the pendulum to the tick-tock of a grandfather clock, to the twinkling keys that introduce the player to Yasunori Mitsuda's score. Whereas Final Fantasy VI's title screen was an omen of things to come, Chrono Trigger's is more of a whimsical invitation into this new world, though not without a hint of foreboding. It's followed up by an opening sequence which gives us a glimpse at the different places and eras you'll be traveling to and the characters you'll meet, but the actual beginning of the story is far more unassuming. The player character, Chrono, is woken up by his mother on the day of the Millennial Fair in the town of Truce. The year is 1000 AD, and the Kingdom of Guardia is celebrating the 400th anniversary of the defeat of the Great Wizard Magus and the end of the Magus War. Chrono's childhood friend, a scientist and inventor named Luca, is an exhibitor at the festival, showing off a teleportation device that she and her father have created. After Chrono successfully demonstrates that the machine works, a girl that he met at the fair, Marl, volunteers to go next. But when the teleporter revs up, her pendant seems to react to it, and rather than being transported into the neighboring pod, Marl is instead sucked into a mysterious portal to parts unknown. Chrono quickly vows to follow and retrieve his new friend, and finds himself in the year 600 AD at the height of the Magus War. At Guardia Castle, he learns that Queen Leene had recently gone missing, but was found just before his arrival. The Queen seems to know Chrono and considers him a friend, inviting him to her quarters where she reveals that she's actually Marl, who vanishes before his very eyes moments later, scared and panicking. Luca catches up shortly afterward, explaining that she recognized Marl as Princess Nadia in their own time, and because she was mistaken to be Queen Leene and the search party was called off, the real queen was never found and thus would never have children, leading to Marl having never been born. The pair investigate a nearby cathedral, which turns out to be a small base of operations for a fiend named Yakra, who has kidnapped not only Queen Leene, but also the Chancellor, the latter of whom he's been impersonating at Guardia Castle. With the help of a warrior frog, simply named Frog, they're able to save Queen Leene and the real Chancellor, and Marl reappears, her existence now assured. But upon returning to their own time, Chrono is put on trial by Guardia's Chancellor for the crime of kidnapping the princess, and is imprisoned pending execution. Luca and Marl bust him out, but are cornered by castle guards in the forest. Another time gate appears, and with no other choice, the trio hop into the portal to escape certain death. This time, they wind up in the far future of 2300 AD, where the world has been devastated by some cataclysmic event that's rendered very few pockets of humanity barely clinging to life in underground bunkers. They eventually find a working terminal which has records of what caused this, and learn that, in 1999 AD, a creature named Lavos emerged from beneath the planet's surface in a maelstrom of fire and fury, wiping out the majority of life on Earth, and leaving the remaining stragglers to die slow, painful deaths. Armed with knowledge of the future, Chrono, Luca, and Marl vow to find a way to prevent the Day of Lavos and save the world. Chrono Trigger's plot isn't a terribly complicated one. It's a bog-standard save-the-world narrative, but with a fourth-dimensional twist. The story hinges on time travel, with information being revealed in an anachronic order to build an air of mystery and tension. But with such a strong focus on time travel comes the risk of making a story feel overly complicated and difficult to follow as a result of this non-linearity. This is why any sort of time travel fiction needs to establish the rules of how time travel works as early as possible in order to give the audience an understanding of how the consequences of a character's actions in the past will affect the present and future. Thankfully, Chrono Trigger is quick to establish the rules it's playing by. Time is like a river, with actions changing the past, creating a new branch of the timeline, which lead to a new present. This is made evident when Marl blinks out of existence when the search for Queen Leene is called off, and the game remains consistent with this, with various minor details in the present changing based on the party's actions in the past. A shining example of this can be seen with the Mayor of Por, who at the start of the story is a man consumed with greed, to the point where it's tearing his family apart. But if you give his ancestors some jerky in the past without charging them for it, then she'll vow to instill the virtues of charity and selflessness in her children. This results in the mayor being an overwhelmingly generous man in the present, and is also the key to completing an optional side quest much later on. There are also numerous black chests strewn throughout some of the later chronological periods that can't initially be opened, but they can be once Marl's pendant has been powered up in Zeal. However, most of them exist in more than one time period, and opening the earliest version of it will mean that it will be opened in the future. But by checking the earliest version of one of these chests and choosing not to open it, then going to open the future version, you'll receive an upgraded version of the loot contained inside while also being allowed to open the past version to receive the original item. It's a fun way of incorporating time travel into general exploration and non-combat gameplay that rewards the player for thinking fourth-dimensionally. This core conceit of actions having consequences isn't restricted solely to time travel either, as when Chrono is put on trial upon his return to the present, the actions and activities the player partook in during the fair are used as evidence of his character. It's these actions which determine the jury's verdict, even if the events that follow ultimately still unfold in the same way. There is, however, a bit of a wrinkle to this aspect of the story. Aside from when Marl is temporarily wiped from existence, none of the members of your party are affected by the changes to the timeline. This wasn't always the case, however, as before the game was completely rebuilt, there was going to be a point where a time paradox would leave the player with a different Marl from the one they started the game with, a Marl from an alternative timeline. But when Sakaguchi fully committed himself to the game and poured over all of the work done for the story up until then, he vetoed the idea for the sake of maintaining consistency when developing the cast. When weighed against Marl's brush with the grandfather paradox, this ethos isn't logically consistent. However, stopping to think about it, Sakaguchi did have a point when this is viewed from a character perspective. If Marl were to have her character change after some time travel shenanigans, and if these changes would persist for the rest of the story, then this could discourage the player from getting attached to other members of the cast, because they could be irreversibly altered at any time. It could even be seen as replacing a character with someone completely different who shares the same name. However, Chrono Trigger isn't the first piece of time travel fiction to maintain consistency with its main cast, in spite of them meddling with the past in ways which would very likely affect who they are as people when given the time to mull over the implications. Back to the Future, while probably not the first to do it this way, is the easiest comparison to make because time travel works pretty much the exact same way. When Marty McFly accidentally interferes with his parents' first meeting in 1955, his very existence is put in jeopardy. Chrono Trigger even incorporates a more truncated version of the film's ripple effect, where it takes a bit of time for the changes made to the timeline to catch up with the time traveler. Like Marty, Marl doesn't immediately vanish when her existence is temporally compromised, though in her case it happens within a matter of hours at the very most, whereas Marty had about a week. And when Marty returns to 1985, he's surprised to find that his whole family and their economic status have changed, despite him being the same person from his original timeline. This aspect continues to persist in the second film, where 1985 as a whole is dramatically altered, and yet Marty remains unchanged. When viewed with this mindset, Chrono Trigger's approach to time travel becomes easier to digest, and it helps that the gaps between each time zone the party travels to are much more significant than those of the Back to the Future trilogy. Whereas those films span about 130 years, Chrono Trigger brings the party as far back as 65 million BC, and as far forward as 2300 AD, and even to the end of time itself, with the smallest gap being about 300 years. And, also like Back to the Future, every time zone is easily identifiable and distinct from the others, which itself is just one facet of Chrono Trigger's phenomenal presentation. Without hyperbole, I can confidently say that Chrono Trigger's overall presentation is the best that I have ever seen on the Super Nintendo. Every time period is distinct, each area is meticulously detailed, and just about every character is lovingly animated. There's a fluidity to Chrono Trigger's visuals that wasn't there in any of the 16-bit Final Fantasies or Dragon Quest V. Part of this is the aforementioned character animation, which makes use of not just more frames, but also bigger, more detailed sprites. There are more than 100 sprites for each party member, allowing them to exhibit a wide emotional range and express their personalities through body language. This is compounded by the removal of grid-based movement, allowing characters to move in 8 directions, even if their sprites only reflect 4 of them. Even the enemies are animated, and while they don't have even a tenth of the number of frames as any given party member, it still imbues them with enough life to be believable. The eras and environments they inhabit are similarly well realized, with amazing visual splendor and careful detail work. One of the more intriguing aspects of the latter is the presence of refrigerators and ovens in 1000 AD, modern appliances one wouldn't expect to find in a fantasy setting like this. But considering that this is also an age where a 19-year-old girl and her father are able to invent karaoke battle bots and teleporters on the regular, these don't seem quite so unbelievable. It's these kinds of visual cues which helped define their respective eras. 1000 AD is peaceful, and so is often bright and colorful. The Millennial Fair, the player's first destination, is the defining example of this. But if you go back to 600 AD, during the height of the Magus War, the world is a bit more visually dour. The general layout of the overworld is almost exactly the same, barring some minor changes to the landscape. But this minor shift in color acts as a visual shorthand for how the world is in a bit of a rough patch. As time travelers, we know it isn't going to last, but that doesn't make the danger any less tangible. This impending peril reaches its apex with Magus's castle, of which the player is given a full view upon their initial approach. It's a striking visual, with the perspective used for the towers, which themselves are veiled in shadows emphasized by the sparse inner light, making them feel even larger. And the very Toriyama-style gargoyle perched atop the central tower in front of the moon brings it all together. There's also something interesting about this gargoyle shot, which I imagine most players probably either wouldn't notice or wouldn't give much of a second thought, and that is aspect ratio, or rather, consideration for aspect ratio. While contemporary TVs display at a 4:3 aspect ratio, the Super Nintendo's native output resolution, 256 by 224 pixels, results in an aspect ratio of roughly 8:7. This is then stretched out horizontally to 4:3 when displayed on a TV. The NES, which had a slightly different resolution of 256 by 240, did the same. However, not every game for the console fully took this stretching into account during development. Super Mario World is an easy example of this, as the game's square blocks become more rectangular when displayed in 4:3, if only slightly. This shot of the moon behind the gargoyle exhibits the Chrono Trigger team taking this stretching into account during development, as looking at a direct rip of the image reveals that the moon isn't actually perfectly round, it was made to be stretched. A mostly inconsequential bit of design trivia perhaps, but it's something I appreciate. While the overworlds for the remaining areas aren't much to look at, they still do their job in establishing tone. 65 million BC is predictably undeveloped, with sparse signs of civilization dotting only a small portion of the Pangea-like supercontinents. The lair of the Reptites, with whom the prehistoric humans are at war, is situated amongst a handful of volcanoes overlooking a massive lake of lava, the reds of which act as a direct inversion of the greens of the forests near which the humans reside. The post-apocalyptic future of 2300 AD is dominated by dark, dingy tones, emblematic of the decay and dereliction that followed the destruction on the day of Lavos. But these ruins, as well as the brief glimpse we saw of 1999 AD, spark the imagination. Why were there some cities in glass domes and others still in the open air? Are those tracks a highway system? A railway system? The optional racing minigame with Johnny suggests the former, but given the state of the world and how long it had been since the apocalypse, it could have been either. Plus, we're only given a very brief and narrow glimpse at the world before Lavos emerged, leaving much of what occurred after Chrono's time to speculation. 12,000 BC isn't much to look at on first glance. The continents have long begun to drift, and the world is in the middle of an ice age. But soon enough, Chrono and company find a beam of light which uplifts them into the skies above, where they find the Kingdom of Zeal, a group of floating islands raised into the heavens by those born with the gift of magic. Zeal is a kingdom of dreams and wonder, where the people seem to want for nothing and live in total opulence. It is beautiful here, but the mood quickly turns tense upon entering the palace. Everywhere else, Zeal is scored to a calming peace with a bit of exoticism imbued through the use of the sitar. But the Zeal Palace track is much more uneasy, eerie. as though you've wandered into something you were never supposed to know about, and now your days are numbered. Compare this to The End of Time, where the party accidentally ends up when they try to time travel with more than 3 people. It's not clear whether this is a where or a when or something in between. It exists outside of time and is where all the gates lead. This small, dim platform in the middle of the shrouded abyss acts as the party's home base of sorts throughout the game, and is otherwise only inhabited by an enigmatic old man who offers advice and hints on what must be done to stop Lavos, and a shapeshifter named Specchio who calls himself the god of war and teaches the party how to use magic. Whereas zeal becomes unsettling upon entering the palace, the end of time, from the moment of discovery, is tranquil. It's a safe place among the chaos of eternity, somewhere to catch your breath and take stock of what's happening and what must be done. This mood is instilled instantly through Mitsuda's score, which imbues the End of Time with the same whimsical air as its enigmatic residents. Chrono Trigger's visuals are assuredly a sight to behold, but the score elevates the overall presentation to the next level in my opinion, and I should hope so if Yasunori Mitsuda was hospitalized over it. I've already made note of the opening track and how it beckons the player with whimsy, but the bombastic title track, which not only accompanies the proceeding montage but plays when the characters answer the call to action, is a much stronger encapsulation of the spirit of adventure which defines Chrono Trigger. It's bright, optimistic, and above all else, determined. In a similar vein is the theme of Guardia Castle, which, in my opinion, is underused as a result of it playing exclusively at, well, Guardia Castle. I especially love the string section here, it really brings the piece together. There are also those quieter tracks with a dreamlike quality which really stick in the mind. Considering that Mitsuda would often sleep in his studio and use his dreams as inspiration for the score, it makes some sense. Peaceful Days, the town theme used in 1000 AD, is a calming piece which reflects Guardia's 400 years of unbroken harmony. There's an innocence to it that I find particularly charming. But stepping away from Chrono's hometown of Truce, we'll see that music give way to this era's overworld theme, Memories of Green. It's mysterious, enticing, and carries just a hint of danger lurking just out of view. And this sentiment carries over into the theme for Guardia Forest. And again in the theme for the cathedral where Queen Leene is held captive, among other segments, except here that mysticism feels much more sinister. The character themes for each party member are also fairly solid musical fare, though not all of them are particularly notable to me. Chrono is represented by the title theme, which is understandable considering both his name and his role as party leader. The only other leitmotifs that stuck with me are the charming music box melody Far Off Promise, which is the theme for not just Marle, but for her and Chrono. Frog's theme, which encapsulates the character's sense of honor, as well as the lonely melancholy bubbling beneath the surface. And Robo's theme, a fun little ditty which had me immediately recalling a certain 1987 dance pop single. When I first heard Robo's theme, I couldn't not hear similarities to Rick Astley's Never Gonna Give You Up, and evidently, I was far from the only person to make this comparison. When asked about it years later, Mitsuda was surprised, as he had never heard the song before the similarities were brought to his attention. Ultimately, it's just a fun coincidence. I would be remiss not to highlight Nobuo Uematsu's contributions to Chrono Trigger. While the final game would ultimately see just 7 tracks from him, not counting the regular boss battle theme that he had arranged but that was composed by Noriko Matsueda, none of them feel out of place or out of step with Mitsuda's work. Of all his tracks, I think the theme for the racing minigame against Johnny in 2300 AD is my favorite. It feels like something straight out of F-Zero. And of course, the battle tracks can't go unmentioned. The standard battle theme is driven by its punchy percussion and a quick rhythmic bass line, but it really comes together around the 25-second mark, with the twinkling xylophone moving between the 2 stereo channels. It feels right at home with the rest of Chrono Trigger's soundtrack. The boss track is dominated by the combination of brass and the organ, and as a result lends itself to these more tense, high-stakes battles. It's during combat that Chrono Trigger best showcases itself as a distillation of its progenitors. Like Final Fantasies 4 through 6, combat is facilitated by an active time battle system, but like Dragon Quest, HP and MP totals are much lower and each character's abilities are more focused. Moreover, the number of active party members has dropped down to 3, with Chrono being mandatory for most of the game, making the player's decision of who to accompany him carry greater weight, even when accounting for the ease of switching them out. You can just press Y at any time outside of battle to swap them around. Compounding this is the game's technique, or tech system, special attacks that cost MP to use. They're unlocked gradually as a character gains tech points, or TP, from battles, just like AP from Final Fantasy V and VI. And after gaining access to the Edge of Time and speaking with Specchio, magic techs are unlocked. Magic is fairly specialized in Chrono Trigger, with most characters being tied to a specific element. Marl uses ice magic, which is an offshoot of water, which Frog uses. Luca uses fire, and Robo, while unable to learn magic due to him being a robot, has shadow elemental attacks. Chrono himself is an interesting case, as in Ted Woolsey's English localization, his element is lightning, but in the original Japanese version, it's heavenly or sky magic. The name was almost certainly changed to conform with Nintendo of America's content policy at the time. It's not a big deal, though it does slightly dilute the dichotomy of light and darkness between Chrono and the villain Magus, but only slightly. Magic also works similar to the original Final Fantasy, where level 1 spells are single target and higher levels affect all targets. All that being said, Chrono Trigger still has plenty of unique qualities to its combat which set it apart from its forebears. Positioning is a key component of battle strategy, with some attacks being more effective based on the distance a character is from an enemy, and certain techs being able to hit larger groups depending on enemy positions. Chrono's Cyclone, for example, is able to hit a group of enemies in a wide circular sweep, and his slash attack hits several in a straight line. And because you can't force enemies into a particular position, there's a risk versus reward factor at play here. Do you wait for the opportunity to unleash a devastating blow on multiple enemies at once, at risk of taking more damage in the process? Or do you beat down whatever is in immediate beatdown range? But there are more to techs than what a single character can do. While individually everyone can only learn a maximum of 8 unique techs, there are dozens of combined double and triple techs that see them combine their skills and abilities to execute unique moves. There are even some special techs which can only be unlocked when certain characters have specific accessories equipped. Luca or Marl can imbue Chrono's sword with fire or ice. Robo can launch Frog through a line of enemies. Chrono can supercharge Ayla's jaw for a nasty bite. These techs cost MP from all participants to use, but for how powerful they are, the cumulative costs are more than worthwhile when faced with a powerful boss. Though truthfully, Chrono Trigger isn't a particularly difficult game. As long as you aren't avoiding enemy encounters, which are no longer random save for the occasional ambush, you shouldn't have to do any grinding to get past any roadblocks. Though by the end, battles can easily become less interesting as characters unlock their most powerful magic techs, and combo attacks become less efficient than just having everyone attack separately. Despite being referred to as ATB version 2.0, there really isn't all that much that's been altered from Final Fantasy VI. The only difference in the system I was able to discern was that ATB gauges now pause when anyone, friend or foe, is executing an attack. It's a little annoying, but the system is otherwise pretty snappy, so it's hardly worth complaining about. Character speed stats have always had an effect on the ATB gauge, but it feels much more pronounced here, especially when the speed cap is at 16, which is very easy to reach for 1 or 2 characters on an initial playthrough. The tempo of battles, combined with the seamless transition between them and exploration, help to keep everything moving, and this extends outside of combat. Just like in the field areas, there are no random encounters on the overworld to impede your progress, and when talking to NPCs, the player is still given full control over their party, allowing them to continue walking around while still receiving dialogue. This is a comparatively small thing to note, but it's actually a remnant of a much more ambitious system planned for Chrono Trigger, which was ultimately cut: the active time event logic system. In short, the player would have been able to influence how different scenes play out by how they interact with other characters or the set dressing while in the middle of a conversation. Trying to walk away from a boss while they give a pre-battle speech, for example, would prompt them to complain about how you're not listening to them, and they would have their minions attack you, preventing you from leaving. It sounds like an interesting idea, one which could have been another way of changing the story and affecting the timeline, but Takashi Takeda's comments on the system from before it was cut may elucidate why it was ultimately stripped out. Quote, "As a developer, naturally when you create a game, you have certain scenes you want to show players, so you focus on getting every detail of that scene just right, tinkering with it until it shows exactly what you want. Sometimes you realize that the event is too long, but even if it is too long, as a developer you just really want to show players what you intended to show them. The active time event logic system was created as a result of our searching for a way to balance those two needs, of the developer's desire to share and the player's desire to have freedom. But implementing this system has been a real challenge. The freedom means you don't know exactly what's going to happen, like you would in a normal Final Fantasy event system." End quote. I can understand the desire to balance the whims of the developers and those of the player. The interactive nature of the medium leads to there being much more of a tug-of-war between the author and the audience than there is with, say, literature or film. But also consider Chrono Trigger's scope, and how many variables, even if they are specifically selected by the developers, already have consequences later down the line. The game already had to be expanded from 24 to 32 megabits to accommodate the wealth of visual assets deemed necessary to make each era distinct, and Yuji Horii's focus on dialogue without paying heed to memory was already an issue. So it's likely that the ATL system may have been cut due to memory or time constraints. It's unfortunate, but truthfully, I don't think it's that big of a loss, as adding more open-ended methods of altering the story, even if ever so slightly, could have had adverse effects on Chrono Trigger's phenomenal pacing. One of the most common traits of RPGs is their extended length. Whether it be due to a wealth of content or its structure, even by 1995, games in the genre had been typified as taking dozens of hours to complete. Chrono Trigger is an exception to this, with a full playthrough, side quests included, clocking in around 20 hours or so, and this is accomplished not by mashing through dialogue and avoiding battles, but through the game's snappy pacing. Even if there isn't always forward momentum in the story, rarely did I feel like I had been in a particular area or time zone for too long before it was time to move on. The script tends to focus on whatever is of immediate importance, which I initially read as glossing over details only for the questions I had to be answered later on when they became relevant. How Melchior forged the Masamune is the biggest example of this, as the sword is used by Frog in 600 AD, but Melchior himself lives in 1000 AD, but it was forged using Dreamstone, which hasn't existed in millennia, necessitating a trip back to 65 million BC to find some in order to fix it. All of this information seems contradictory, and while Melchior does ask the party if they want to hear the story after they ask him about it, he doesn't actually tell them anything, not even a cryptic riddle. However, the music that plays while he works to repair it foreshadows the truth that isn't revealed until much, much later, that Melchior is one of the 3 gurus of the Kingdom of Zeal who was flung from his own time when the Queen awakened Lavos in 12,000 BC. In fact, while just about every single conflict in the story can be traced back to Lavos itself, a fair amount of narrative significance is placed on Zeal and the Ocean Palace incident. Not only are the gurus of reason, time, and life, Balthazar, Gaspar, and Melchior, respectively, transported across time during the incident, but so was the Queen's son, Janus, who ended up in the Middle Ages and was raised by monsters. Over time, he cultivated his magical abilities, became their leader, and adopted a new name, Magus. The gurus, meanwhile, each act as guides for Chrono and the others as they work towards defeating Lavos. Balthazar was transported to sometime after the day of Lavos, and transported his consciousness into a new as death drew closer, but he leaves the party with a time ship, the Epoch, to travel through history without needing to rely on gates. Melchior, as already discussed, ended up in the present where he lives out his days as a blacksmith. He's even selling his wares at the Millennial Fair at the beginning of the game, and asks Chrono if he can convince Marl to sell him her pendant, another bit of foreshadowing as Marl's pendant used to belong to Queen Zeal's daughter, Shala. And Gaspar would find himself at the end of time, where he would remain until the party finds their way here during the story, by which time he can hardly remember who he was before. Now he merely observes time itself, and acts as the party's most consistent guide throughout the story. For the most part, Ted Woolsey's localization of the game is pretty solid, but not without its alterations or faults. Even with an expanded 32 megabit ROM, there were still data restrictions that necessitated cutting down the script at points to get it all to fit when translated into English. And of course, things like alcohol had to be censored due to Nintendo of America's content policies. Woolsey would also take a few creative liberties in trying to make the experience just a bit more appealing to Western sensibilities. For example, Magus' top henchmen, Vinegar, Soisa, and Mayonai, all named after condiments as Akira Toriyama is wont to do, were changed to Ozzy, Slash, and Flea respectively, after rock musicians Ozzy Osbourne, guitarist Slash from Guns N' Roses, and Flea, the bassist for the Red Hot Chili Peppers. But beyond merely changing some punny names, Woolsey would also infuse the script with some light religious references, which have since led to some more biblical readings of Chrono Trigger's story. The most significant was the names of the 3 gurus, whose original names were Gash, Hash, and Bosch. Renaming them to Balthazar, Gaspar, and Melchior, respectively, invokes the names of the 3 wise men who brought gifts of myrrh, gold, and frankincense to the newborn baby Jesus in Christian mythology: Balthazar, Caspar, and Melchior. According to Woolsey, he saw the end of days with Lavos and the narrative taking place over eons as being resonant with some themes from Western religions, and thought these slight alterations seemed appropriate to help bolster what the story was doing. Though he also acknowledges that what was there in the Japanese version wasn't intended to air close to Christianity, and that what he ended up injecting into it with his script was the result of working under a tight deadline while balancing numerous elements in his head, and coming up with something that worked for the new audience while still supporting the story. For the record, I don't buy the interpretation of Chrono Trigger being a retelling of the Bible or anything along those lines. I can understand how some can see certain parts of the game as parallels or references, but even without considering Ted Woolsey's account, I think those supposed allusions are more coincidence than anything, aesthetic choices at the very most. But in keeping with the time travel motif, Chrono Trigger takes the player's choices into consideration when it's time for the credits to roll. The game has multiple endings, and while several of them are minor iterations on the true ending, the player is able to see radically different endings based on when they defeat Lavos during the adventure. Despite it being the final boss, nothing is stopping you from using a bucket at the end of time to transport the party to the Day of Lavos and face it head-on. Most of these alternative endings are played for laughs, just fun little rewards for beating the game faster, but truthfully, most of them are out of reach until a second or even third playthrough via New Game Plus. After beating the game once, the player is able to select this option from the menu and start the game from the beginning with all of the items, equipment, and progress from a previous playthrough, with a few minor plot-related exceptions like the Masamune. This was incorporated as a result of playtesters feeling compelled to play the game over again to see how the story would have changed if they made different decisions. The game isn't any more difficult to compensate either. You can just blitz through it at high levels to try your hand at seeing the different endings. It's not the first game to allow players to carry progress from one playthrough into the next, but it is the first game to call it New Game Plus. It's definitely cathartic to plow through areas in minutes that previously took up to an hour to clear, quickening the game's pace to absurd degrees. But something I feel gets left by the wayside in the game's haste, even under normal circumstances, is the characters. Let me preface my discussion of the party by saying that I place a lot of value on characters in stories. This isn't to say that it's the only thing I care about, but that complex characters whose goals and growth tie into the themes of the story, and whose conflicts go beyond the physical and into the ideological or philosophical, can elevate a good story into a great one in my eyes. Chrono Trigger doesn't really have much of these things. That's not to say the characters are bad or that I don't like any of them. On the contrary, they're fairly likable and well-defined. Luca is Chrono's childhood friend who loves to tinker with machines and gadgets. She's the brains of the group. Marl is a rebellious princess with daddy issues who has the hots for Chrono. Frog is an anxiety-riddled knight who's haunted by his failures. Robo is a robot that's trying to understand friendship and human emotions. Ayla is a savage cave lady from the dawn of time who values strength, but not to the detriment of her own humanity. Nobody here is especially lacking in personality, but I found myself not caring all that much for most of them. Part of this is a matter of contrasts, as not everyone's stories are explored much in the main story. Frog and Robo are integrated into the narrative quite well. The former has a personal history and enmity with Magus. Frog was once a human squire named Glenn, who grew up being teased by the other kids and having his best friend Cyrus ward them off. Cyrus saw the makings of a great swordsman in Glenn, and urged him to join him in becoming a knight of the Kingdom of Guardia, but Glenn initially refused because he didn't want to hurt people. He would eventually relent and become Cyrus's squire, befriending Queen Leene during his service. But after many escapades with Cyrus, his old friend would be felled by Magus, who had transformed Glenn into an anthropomorphic frog as a final insult. It was during this scuffle that the Masamune would be broken. Eschewing his old name, Frog would continue to fight against Magus's forces, but his shame would lead him to abandoning the kingdom, and while he would come to Guardia's aid when Queen Leene was kidnapped, his failure to prevent her capture and keep his only remaining friends safe would send him deeper into his decade-long shame spiral. It's only after Chrono and the others repair the Masamune and recover the hero medal and show their belief in him that Frog regains some faith in himself, enough to have them accompany him to Magus's castle to finish the sorcerer off. The timing couldn't be more perfect either, as Magus was preparing to summon Lavos when the party enters his lair. But before Frog can land the killing blow, Lavos begins to awaken, warping space-time and blasting them through the time stream. It's only much later on, after the Ocean Palace incident, when Frog is presented with another opportunity to face Magus again. But this time, the player has the choice of whether to fight or spare him. Fighting him will lead to Magus' spell being broken, and Frog will become Glenn again at the end of the story. But he knows that killing Magus wouldn't actually change anything. Cyrus would still be dead, and he would still have spent the past decade of his life wallowing in his own self-loathing. All of this is pushed front and center. It can't be skipped over, and the player must actively involve themselves in Frog's arc. Killing Magus here may bring short-term relief, but it would be a hollow victory in every regard. Frog struggles with what it means to be strong, to be a hero, and to be honorable. By sparing his mortal enemy, the man who took his life away and brought him to his lowest point, he stands to gain wisdom, honor, and a new ally in the fight against Lavos. While he doesn't exactly become buddy-buddy with anyone, Magus does join the party for the last several hours of the game if he's spared. We'll wrap back around to him in a bit, but his inclusion as a playable character acts not only as a suitable thematic extension of Frog's arc, but as a great mechanical reward for investing yourself in Frog's character and understanding the decisions he would make given the circumstances. It's not the end of Frog's story, as later on you have the opportunity to bring him closure on Cyrus, but this, to me, is the apex. Robo, comparatively, has much less time devoted to him in the main story, but what he got provoked the strongest emotional response from me in the entire game. When the party first finds him in the post-apocalyptic year of 2300 AD, he's in a state of disrepair. Luca is surprised and excited to find a humanoid robot and thinks she can repair it, disregarding Marl's concerns that it may attack them because machines can't inherently be evil, it's humans who program them that way. When she's finished repairing the robot, it addresses everyone quite formally and asks how it may serve them. When asked for its name, it responds with its serial number, R66Y. While it isn't specifically clear what its original purpose was, we can gather in these moments that it was likely utilitarian in nature. It's only after Marl asks Chrono what they should call their new robot buddy that this begins to change. Robo, as he's now been dubbed, begins asking questions about what happened here and how the party survived the day of Lavos. He accompanies them to power down a generator at a factory so that they can access the time gate that brought them here, and it's here where they encounter the rest of the R-series robots. Robo is excited to see them, but they meet his enthusiasm with violent hostility, decrying him as being defective, tainted by human influence. Apparently, he was supposed to eliminate any humans who infiltrated the facility, and for failing to enact this most basic directive, the rest of the R-series relentlessly attack him. Robo doesn't even try to defend himself. He's just confused as to how he could be defective for not wanting to hurt the only humans he knows. He already considers Chrono, Luca, and Marl to be his friends, as he did with the R-series, and rather than hurt his old friends, even as they're savagely beating him into disrepair, he pleads with them to stop, but to no avail. This scene nearly brought me to tears. It's so simple, but so effective at the same time. Luca is able to repair him once more, and during this process, she asks him what he plans to do for the future. Nobody has ever asked Robo this before, and when the party is ready to go back through the gate, he decides to join them in their quest to stop Lavos. The other robots that he thought were his friends believe him to be defective, and with humanity dying out, there's nothing left for him here now. Robo isn't a complicated character by any means, but the childlike manner in which he experiences new concepts like friendship and betrayal is very endearing. He becomes more than just a machine. He finds personhood. Robo is my son, and I love him, and I will protect him with my life. Do not challenge me on this. However, like Frog, this is not the end of Robo's story. Like most of the others, their arcs conclude during optional side quests at the end of the game, but whereas their quests follow on from what was presented in the story, with Frog putting Cyrus's spirit to rest and finding closure, and Robo defeating the supercomputer that was using him to orchestrate the final downfall of humanity and establish robots as the dominant species, the others don't. Marl's follows on from some very missable scenes with her father, which explore their antagonistic relationship and how King Guardia is overprotective of her because of the death of her mother, Queen Eliza. She had taken ill when Marl was young, but according to the Chancellor, the king was too preoccupied with his royal duties to make the time to see his wife as she was dying. The Chancellor even goes as far as to say to Marl that her father indirectly killed her mother. Prior to these scenes, the only glimpse we get into their relationship is at the end of Chrono's trial, showing how dismissive the king is of Marl's opinions and desires, completely disregarding her testimony defending Chrono, and telling her to forget about what she experienced outside the castle. The animosity is cranked up to, quite frankly, ludicrous degrees in these optional scenes, wherein they blow up at and disown each other. You can have Marl try to bring her father his favorite food, jerky, to mend fences, but he goes berserk over how she knows he has high cholesterol, and that this would exacerbate it, saying that this is the last straw and that he doesn't ever want to see her face again. Marl being a rebellious princess with daddy issues isn't a unique foundation on which to build a character. Princess Jasmine in Disney's Aladdin is a contemporary example of a similar character, but whereas Jasmine's daddy issues only concern the Sultan's insistence that she marry a prince and otherwise loves and cherishes her, which she understands, Marl's relationship with her father is extremely combative as a result of poor communication and misinformation. Her side quest revolves around her father being put on trial by the Chancellor for allegedly selling the Rainbow Shell, which can be found and moved to the castle as part of another side quest for some extra cash. In actuality, the Chancellor is really a descendant of Yakra, the monster that had kidnapped Queen Lean in the Middle Ages, in disguise, trying to exact his revenge on Guardia's royal family by deposing the king and ascending the throne. He even had his cronies infiltrate the royal guard. Despite the bad blood, Marl goes out of her way to prove her father's innocence, and when she finds the rainbow shell deep in the castle's basement, she finds it with a letter from Queen Lean, who has figured out that Marl is her time-traveling descendant. This is where I personally take umbrage with Marl's story. Lean's letter is very apologetic to Marl's father, saying how the bond they share through blood is unbreakable and that when she has children of her own, she'll understand where he's coming from. And Marl takes her ancestors' words to heart, as when she makes up with her father, she notes that she should have considered his feelings after the king admitted that he was wrong for being so bull-headed. They ultimately open up about how they felt about the loss of Marl's mother, what Marl had been doing since she ran away with Chrono and Luca, and the king agrees to let her continue her quest to save the world. The issue I have with this resolution is how it's written to both sides the situation. The king wanting to protect Marl because he lost his wife, whom he loved and cared for deeply, is more than understandable. Having him being bad at communicating this and being overprotective is also a reasonable character flaw. Marl responding with anger is understandable as well. But the king definitely crossed some lines here by telling Marl he didn't want to see her again, that they're no longer family, and blowing up on her when she tried to bring him his favorite food to smooth things over. To have the resolution lie partially in Marl apologizing for not thinking about how he felt after those kinds of outbursts is simply audacious, ludicrous. Now, I will fully admit that I am coming at this from a very different perspective than what was intended. I have my own personal baggage when it comes to this kind of thing, but even if I didn't, I also come from a part of the world where deferment to our elders is not an absolute virtue. However, filial piety is a major aspect of Japanese culture, an almost unflinching respect for one's parents and other elders simply by virtue of them being their elders. So whereas at least here in the United States, this can end up reading a bit poorly depending on one's personal values regarding parenthood, in Japan it was likely meant to be taken as something more uplifting. The subplot was a good idea on paper, but its execution was, at least to me, a bit dodgy. If anything, it didn't really make me like Marl anymore as a character as much as it made me hate her father, even though the fake Chancellor was whispering into both of their ears. But this isn't the only side quest that puts a spotlight on a character's parent. In the Fiona's Forest side quest, the party meet a woman in the Middle Ages named Fiona, whose home used to be surrounded by lush forests which have been wiped out by mystics in the war. After they defeat a monster in the nearby desert that's been preventing more trees from growing, Fiona is relieved that the forest could return, but laments that it would take a gargantuan effort to plant and tend to all the trees. Robo volunteers to stay with Fiona and fulfill her wish, and the party zips forward to 1000 AD to find that Fiona's home has been converted into a shrine in her honor, and that it's surrounded by woodlands once more. Time has taken its toll on Robo, though, and Luca spends the night repairing him once more with everyone around the campfire. Visually, it's a very pretty scene, but I'm here more to talk about its content and what it leads into. It's during these repairs that Robo shares some thoughts he's been having about the nature of the gates and his doubts that Lavos has anything to do with them. He posits that some entity may be using the gates to show them specific points in history, and Ayla and Frog expound on this, hypothesizing that this entity may be dying and reliving its most profound memories. Or maybe its saddest memories, ruminating on how things could have been done differently, how they could have been done better. Marl asks Luca if there's some point in time she'd want to go back to, but Luca says she doesn't like to think about it. We'll come back to this whole entity thread in due time, but for now, let's focus on Luca. Luca wakes up in the middle of the night and goes on a short walk while everyone else is sound asleep. It doesn't take long for her to come across a mysterious red gate. She steps into it and finds herself transported back to her childhood bedroom on June 24th, 990 AD. We're clued into this by the journal entry Luca finds shortly after her arrival. Back then, she hated science and resented how obsessed her father was with it, but walking into the main living space quickly shows us why this day is so significant to Luca. It was the day of her mother's accident, when she lost the use of her legs. Lara had little dialogue in 1000 AD. She was confined to a chair and never left the house, even to see her daughter's teleporter exhibit at the Millennial Fair. She even complains about how her husband and daughter only care about their, quote, silly toys. It's not stated outright, but there's the implication that Lara has grown distant from Luca and Taban as a result of her injury. Luca's been brought back to that day, a day she knows all too well. The day her mother's skirt got caught in her husband's newest invention while trying to dust it off, and the 9-year-old Luca could only stand there and watch helplessly as her mother's legs were mangled by her father's machine. The guilt born from her powerlessness drove her to learn more about mechanics and machinery in order to prevent anything like it from happening again. This time, however, 19-year-old Luca is able to put a stop to it. Taban wrote down a pretty obvious hint to the password in the kitchen before heading out that day. It's his wife's name. The method of inputting it isn't made clear at first, but it's similar to the crane controls in the factory in 2300 AD. You input a certain button combination on the controller. In this case, it's LARA. Lara is saved, and a quick trip to Luca's house in 1000 AD confirms this, as she gets up and goes on about how she's going to do some cleaning and take a walk. Luca successfully gave her mother her life back after living 10 long years with her on the sidelines, assuming you're able to figure out how to input the password. I've heard plenty of people refer to this scene as one of the game's big emotional highlights. So why doesn't it make me feel anything? Part of it may be because, until this point, Lara is barely present at best and totally missable at worst. Luca's relationship with her is never brought up before now either, but I think the most likely reasons are A, I didn't find Luca to be all that interesting before now, and B, this backstory comes incredibly late, almost out of nowhere, and is never brought up again. It leaves no lasting impact on the character, it feels extremely tacked on, and as it turns out, it kind of was. In a 2014 interview with Famitsu, Yoshinori Kitase noted that at least Marl and Luca's side stories were incredibly late additions to the game. Their deadline was looming large, and Sakaguchi said that they should expand on the characters more with extra scenes. Kitase himself put Luca's together, and Takashi Tokita implemented Marl's. This honestly doesn't surprise me all that much. But again, this is just how I feel about these particular side quests. I wasn't all that invested in Luca or Marl, and these didn't really move the needle for me. The same kind of goes for Ayla, who doesn't even get a side quest, but at least we spend a decent amount of time with her front and center in the main story. I definitely find her to be more interesting than the literal splitting of Bulma's personality, but not by much. And to me, none of them even hold a candle to Magus, who spent years accruing power and using the mystics to his own ends in order to take on Lavos himself and exact his revenge. In the original timeline, he seems to get destroyed by the creature, but due to our interference, he's instead flung back to Zeal in 12,000 BC, where he uses his knowledge of the events yet to come to act as a prophet for his unsuspecting mother, the Queen. Lavos took away his mother, his sister Shala, his kingdom, and his whole life. Of course he would want revenge. The only reason he joins up with us after the Ocean Palace incident is because we share a common goal. His side quest isn't even to build his character either, it's basically just a rushdown of his former henchmen to tie up loose ends. This inadvertently creates a more harmonious future for the world, as the mystics who worshipped Magus and then Ozzy in 1000 AD while still holding a grudge against humans will now live peacefully with no ill will. Obviously, this was just a side effect, as Magus doesn't really care about anyone except himself and Shala, whose fate after the Ocean Palace incident is left ambiguous. Unlike the others, Magus's story actually ties directly into the broader conflict and is much more personal. He doesn't really grow much as a character, but his motivations and actions are what make him interesting. While he was definitely an antagonist for most of the story, this antagonism is born more from circumstance and a bit of misunderstanding than malice. Magus doesn't really care about the mystics he commands or the humans they hate. He's just using them as a means to an end. He had no personal enmity with Cyrus, Glenn, or Chrono. He just didn't want his revenge plot to be impeded. He's single-minded in that sense, but after finally getting the chance to exact his vengeance and realizing just how powerful Lavos really is, he recognizes that he can't take it down alone and makes a pact with the heroes to make sure that the next time he meets Lavos, it will be destroyed for good. Not for the good of the world, but because he's got issues to work out that stem from the impact Lavos had on him personally. I guess you could say Magus is my favorite character here. That just leaves one final party member, Chrono himself. Chrono is a silent protagonist, a cipher upon which the player is meant to imprint themselves. This was done at the behest of Yuji Horii, but the final decision wasn't made lightly. The game's staff were split on the matter, but Takashi Takeda, Yoshinori Kitase, and Kazuhiko Aoki came around on the idea when they considered the advantages of making Chrono a silent protagonist. It mostly boiled down to allowing the player to become more easily invested in him and the game through there being less of a chance for him to do something the player wouldn't find agreeable. The very concept of a silent protagonist in games is a bit of a double-edged sword in this regard, and the development staff have to not only compensate for it, but also build around it. Kitase even noted this in so many words in the same interview where he, Tokita, and Aoki discussed the decision to make Chrono silent. Unfortunately, it didn't do anything for me, as he's surrounded by other characters who are well-defined and supposedly cultivate bonds with him, but he never says or does anything aside from what one would expect from the protagonist of an RPG. Also, that one joke ending where Luca and Marl judge all the male characters. But this was a joke ending, so I don't really count it. I didn't buy into his supposed budding relationship with Marl because it's totally one-sided. I can accept him and Luca being childhood friends, but only because Luca does all the heavy lifting by acting very familiar with him. Frog sees the makings of a great swordsman in Chrono, which is understandable because they fought alongside each other to save Queen Leene. And Ayla admires strength and admires Chrono when she recognizes this quality in him. However, all of this is pretty surface level. It's meant to make the player feel personally involved in the things that are happening, which on its face is more than reasonable. However, Chrono and most of the rest of the cast aren't really personally invested in much of what's going on around them, aside from whatever is happening in their specific eras. Take Frog out of the Middle Ages or Ayla from prehistory, and they're mostly just along for the ride. For Chrono specifically, it's that matter of contrasts I brought up earlier. And later on, contrivance. Contrasts in that everyone around him is more of an actual character than he is, and contrivance in that the game flat out says that he is cosmically significant because reasons. At the Ocean Palace, the player is forced into a confrontation with Lavos for the very first time. You could fight him in 1999 AD at any point before this, but that was up to your discretion. Here, you have no choice but to make a stand and stop Queen Zeal from inadvertently destroying the world in her lust for power. The battle can technically be won if you know what you're doing, but Lavos is much more powerful in this context than if you fought it any other time. You can win, but you're supposed to lose. Even when everyone, including Shala, is powerless to stop Queen Zeal and Lavos, Chrono gets back up in defiance and pays the ultimate price. Lavos completely vaporizes him, with his soul seeming to be the only thing that remains. This is a major turning point in the narrative, as is the rest of the Ocean Palace, and is clearly meant to be an emotional punch to the gut. The character meant to represent you, the player, has dissolved into oblivion like tissue paper, and for what it's worth, I feel this scene does elevate Chrono a bit beyond being merely a cipher. He is truly determined to do what he feels is right and help people in need. It's not exactly a complex modus operandi for an RPG protagonist, but it is relatable and adds a bit of personality that would fall in line with the player's goals. Of course you would want to protect Shala and keep fighting given the opportunity, no matter how hopeless it seemed. Moreover, Chrono has always been a permanent fixture in the party up until this point, so no matter what, you've had no choice but to use him, and he was likely your star player. Losing him means you lose your ace, but it's also meant to feel like losing part of yourself, your strongest link to the rest of the characters and to this world. And yet, I felt almost nothing. Because even with these small wrinkles of personality, especially when facing his own mortality, Chrono is still a cipher at the end of the day. Losing Robo, Frog, Marl, or even Luca would have left far more of an impact on me because, while I don't quite gel with all of them, I still see each of them more as characters than I do Chrono. The most I felt when Chrono died was minor irritation. Oh great, now who's going to be my ace? The answer to that would turn out to be Magus, since his strength is comparable to Chrono's and he has versatile techs, but that's beside the point. But then I think back on the game's quick pacing and modest difficulty and thought that, because of how accessible Chrono Trigger is to newcomers to the genre, this would probably be more effective for that type of player, especially younger players, than it was on me. For what it's worth, Chrono's demise is able to be undone. At the end of time, Gaspar hands you the titular Chrono Trigger, or Time Egg based on its appearance, representing limitless potential. But that potential could also be quite limited. It's entirely possible that it may not hatch at all. Balthazar points the party in the right direction to bring Chrono back. The nearby Death Peak can supposedly restore life, but only if the person that would be brought back is important to the space-time continuum, and that they have an exact copy of the deceased. Thankfully, there's someone at the Millennial Fair, Norstein Beckler, who creates copies of people as part of a minigame, and with enough silver, one of these clones can be purchased. With both in hand, when the party reach the apex of Death Peak, Marl's pendant begins reacting to the Time Egg, causing it to hatch and sending them all to the moment of Chrono's death at the Ocean Palace. Except time is frozen, giving them the opportunity to replace the real Chrono with the lifeless clone, and abscond with their friend, now safe and sound. The scene where Chrono wakes up and is welcomed back plays out slightly differently depending on who's in your party, but regardless of who ultimately embraces and pours their heart out to him, you guessed it, I still didn't feel anything. I was just glad to have my ace back. Of course, you don't have to bring Chrono back, and the ending will be different if you don't, but after spending so many hours building him up, it just makes sense that you would want him back for gameplay reasons, even if you don't care for him as a character. I understand that to some I'm sounding a bit harsh, but for what it's worth, the presentation for these scenes, like the rest of the game, is top-notch. And while I'm personally not all that invested in most of these characters, Chrono especially, I can understand why others would be, and don't think less of anyone whose opinions on them are completely opposite of my own. I just think that, out of all that Chrono Trigger has to offer, the characters are easily the weakest part of the package. But the rest of it is strong enough that, while I won't gloss over it or give it a complete pass, I still enjoy the overall experience. And much like the world itself, much of that experience is colored by the presence and influence of Lavos. Until now, I've avoided discussing Lavos directly too much because, like Kefka in Final Fantasy VI, its full scope isn't really made clear until the final battle. But whereas Kefka came off as just an insane psychopath who we learn at the end actually had some kind of guiding philosophy driving his actions, in Chrono Trigger there's a mystery to Lavos that unravels as the story unfolds. Initially, it's just a creature that emerges from beneath the Earth's surface that unleashes Armageddon, but there isn't any indication of what it is or why it was buried to begin with. Not long after learning about the threat Lavos poses to the world, the player ends up going to Medina Village in 1000 AD, where the mystics that descended from those who fought in the Magus War eagerly await Lavos' emergence, believing it'll wipe out all of humanity while presumably not affecting them. In the moment, it implies to the player that Magus probably created Lavos himself, but when facing off against him later, Magus says that, contrary to Robo's records, he didn't create Lavos, but merely summoned it. It's been absorbing the planet's energy and gaining more and more power for who knows how long. Well, we eventually learn exactly how long, because during one of our visits to 65 million BC, a red star appears in the sky and slowly grows bigger. That star turns out to be Lavos, which, upon its fiery impact, wipes out the reptites that had threatened to extinguish humanity's ancestors and thus begins the Ice Age. This is also when it's christened Lavos by Ayla, with La meaning fire and Vos meaning big. Unfortunately, big fire burrows underground before the dust can settle, so Chrono and the gang are unable to deal with it before it becomes a problem. It's in the Kingdom of Zeal in 12,000 BC when the narrative and the mystery of Lavos begin to reach their crescendo. Zeal itself is the home of the so-called Enlightened Ones, those who hold the gift of magic, and is situated on a series of floating islands. While the floating continent or castle had been a recurring motif in both Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest by this point, its name, Zeal, is anything but subtle. The zealotry of its citizens invokes the origin point for the trope, not just Hayao Miyazaki's Laputa, but Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift, which I discussed all the way back in my FF1 retrospective. But the source of their power actually comes from Lavos, something that they're all keenly aware of as they worship it as a god, not knowing of the terrible fate it has in store for the planet. In fact, they've been constructing the Ocean Palace in order to bring their Mammon machine, which has been siphoning Lavos' power, closer to the beast in order to draw even more from it. This was what awakened Lavos in the original timeline, sending the Gurus and Janus to different eras. It was when the Mammon machine was initially completed and began drawing Lavos' power from within the palace that Queen Zeal began to change, becoming more devoted to Lavos and unhinged in her desire to harness its power for herself. The Gurus and the Queen's children, Janus and Shala, quickly took notice of this change in her disposition, and Janus wouldn't even consider her to be his mother anymore before too long. Melchior, who created the Mammon machine, hands Chrono a ruby knife, forged with Dreamstone, in the hopes that it could destroy the machine before it's too late. Unfortunately, it is far too late, as while the ruby knife is able to mess with the transfer of energy within the machine, transforming it into the Masamune, Lavos awakens shortly after. After Chrono is obliterated by the creature, Shala uses the last of her power to transport the rest of the party and Magus out of the Ocean Palace to safety, though her own fate is unknown. The result of Queen Zeal awakening Lavos sees the destruction of her kingdom, leaving her remaining subjects to coexist with the earthbound ones on the surface as the Ice Age comes to an end. And her remaining within the Ocean Palace sees the structure warp and transform into the extratemporal Black Omen, which looms over the world from the moment of its rise from beneath the sea to the day of Lavos in 1999 AD. It not only remains in a single spot floating above the earth waiting for you to approach and initiate the final battle, but to future generations, it's not even a concern. It's just a part of the scenery to them, a fact of life like clouds or mountains. It's unsettling, knowing how much of an existential threat it poses to them all, but they discuss it as casually as they would the weather. The Black Omen is the final dungeon and can be fought through in either 12,000 BC, 600 AD, 1000 AD, or all of the above if you are feeling adventurous. Of course, you could skip it entirely and just fight Lavos head-on in 1999 AD, but then you would miss the confrontation with Queen Zeal, and if you bring Magus to that fight, he'll trash-talk her and his battle theme will override hers, which is a nice touch. Lavos itself is a neat fight, as it draws on the powers and mechanics of most of the bosses you've faced throughout the story in its first phase, but afterward is when it gets more interesting. The first phase was just the outer shell, with the last two phases deep inside. The second phase loosely continues with the insect-like visual motif from the outer shell, with a design that resembles a fusion between Imperfect Cell and Piccolo from Dragon Ball. But it's the start of the third and final phase, which departs from the insect theme altogether and treads further into the realm of the alien, that reframes practically the entire story and the nature of the world. After transforming, Lavos transmits its thoughts into the party's minds, revealing that it guided the trajectory of human development and evolution over millions of years, so that it may harvest them for its own purposes. As seen in 2300 AD, Lavos reproduces as its offspring are fought on the way up to Death Peak, and these offspring eventually leave to find other worlds to continue this cycle. Whether Lavos is truly intelligent and there's a grander purpose behind it doing this, or if it's merely a creature doing this out of instinct, isn't clear, but regardless, this puts all of humanity's progress and accomplishments into a new, much more harrowing perspective. We already knew that humanity's survival beyond Ayla's time wasn't strictly due to their overcoming of Azala and the Reptites, but because Lavos wiped those lizards out. But now we know that humanity only survived the Ice Age, discovered magic, rose Zeal into the sky, survived the Magus War, and continued to become technologically advanced in the future because Lavos wanted them to. Were any human achievements really our own, or the result of Lavos' influence? Queen Zeal became a fanatical puppet of this eldritch horror, but aside from her subjects, were there any others before or after her? Obviously, if there were, none of them would reach the same heights as her, but it's disturbing to think about. What about the Mystics? Did Lavos have any considerations for them beyond making sure humanity defeated them in the war? Or were they entirely incidental? And what of this hypothetical entity that everybody ruminated on in the forest? Well, that isn't terribly difficult to discern, if it even exists. If it's reliving significant moments in its life during its dying moments, and those significant events and ultimate end revolve around Lavos, then the best guess would be that the entity is the planet itself, Lavos' most significant victim. And sure enough, Masato Kato has confirmed that this is the case. This battle between higher powers, in which humanity are merely pawns, lends an air of existentialism to Chrono Trigger. When all of humanity is being uplifted for the sake of being harvested by an unknowable alien being resting deep beneath the planet's surface for millions of years, how much does free will really matter? Their development was guided by something else beyond their knowledge or comprehension. They'll have no say in how they'll be wiped out. In the end, does anything they do really matter beyond how it will enrich and benefit Lavos? Well, considering that our heroes are successful in the end, yes, it obviously does. But it's not something that the characters themselves are given much opportunity to ruminate on. Instead, they're immediately resolute in the face of this revelation. And when our heroes quickly make up their minds, the player is given little time to reflect on it themselves because the people they're meant to identify with have already made that decision for them. It's not the conclusion that's interesting here, but rather the implications of the information given. Compare this to Final Fantasy VI, where the theme of finding a reason to live pervades the entire back half of the game, before being challenged when confronting Kefka at the very end. FF6 weaves these themes into its world and story, whereas Chrono Trigger only has light foreshadowing for a reveal which is then given little time for reflection. The only character who has been given any kind of time to think on this sort of quandary is Robo, who during his side quest learns that he was created for the sole purpose of wiping out the last traces of humanity in order to help establish machines as the dominant species on Earth. His purpose was predetermined, but he fought against it, forging his own path. Marl kind of has something like this, as it's inherent to being a rebellious princess, but her dilemma is rooted in the people and systems around her rather than philosophy. There was one idea during development that could have leaned a bit more into this existential bent, however. Originally, Chrono's death was going to be a much more permanent affair, with the only way to get him back being to travel back in time to the night before the Millennial Fair to recruit a version of him from before the beginning of the game. Then, after defeating Lavos, he would be dropped back off in his own time, turning the story into a sort of time loop for the player. This would have been an especially bold move, as not only would this have been done to the silent protagonist, but by doing this to the Cypher, it would more directly involve the player in this existential crisis. Imagine, instead of needing to manually select the New Game Plus option, the game would merely start again from the beginning after the credits have finished, now with a bit of new inner monologue invoking the existential dread Chrono probably feels now, knowing that he will inevitably die and has no choice in the matter. I'm not sure if this direction would have necessarily been better, but it's interesting to think about, and could have provided the player with more to ponder. While Yuji Horii was on board with having Chrono die, according to an interview with Masato Kato for the Chrono Trigger Ultimania published in 2009, the story needed to have a happy ending, and so the clone swap idea was used instead. Plus, the idea of going back to get another Chrono would have run afoul of Sakaguchi's mandate that the characters not be changed as a result of time travel shenanigans. Some of the endings rub up against this, notably the Reptite ending, but these are more bonus rewards for skilled, persistent, and curious players rather than legitimate alternative conclusions. I want to emphasize that I don't think Lavos is a bad or ineffective villain. Its flirtation with existentialism adds an extra layer of intrigue to the creature that previously was hardly present and makes it much more threatening. But if the revelation is removed, nothing about the story or characters fundamentally changes. No obstacle, physical or otherwise, is removed from their path, even if all the foreshadowing remains intact. At best, the revelation of Lavos' influence acts as an interesting bit of existential dread that reframes the events of the story and puts them in a much darker and more sinister light. At worst, it's a tacked-on bit of fluff that appears to try and add depth to something which, frankly, wasn't all that deep. But given the choice, I would choose to keep it, because otherwise, Chrono Trigger's story would honestly be just okay. I will admit that there is much to discuss regarding Chrono Trigger as a game, and a fair amount that I did not delve into. The Earthbound ones, the humans and reptites of prehistory, the various endings, the fact that we run into several ancestors and even a descendant of Marl, including Ayla. But truthfully, much of it boils down to extraneous details that widen the scope of the story, but not so much its depth. I've been critical of this game, but I don't find any aspect of it to be bad. Lacking, yes, but not bad. Chrono Trigger is a unique experience, and definitely a highlight of the Super Nintendo's library, as well as the RPG genre at large. It's fairly breezy, has solid pacing that staves off repetition, and phenomenal presentation. The game's mastery over tone and atmosphere is practically unmatched. What brings it down for me really are the characters and, to a lesser extent, the narrative. The latter is pretty simple and merely flirts with deeper ideas, but it is still fairly solid and enjoyable for what it is. And while I have my issues with the characters, none of them are necessarily deal breakers. I don't find most of them to be all that interesting, but they're charming enough. I hesitate to say that anything about Chrono Trigger that I didn't quite jive with are faults, as there isn't really anything about the game that doesn't work. It's really just a matter of taste. But I also find it dull to talk about media that doesn't have much in the way of flaws, but also little that truly captivated me. Chrono Trigger falls into this category, but it's still a game I would wholeheartedly recommend to anybody, even those with little to no experience with the genre. It's pretty, it's not terribly complicated, it doesn't waste your time establishing the main conflict or getting to the end, it's not hard, it's got enough intrigue to keep you engaged, and it has enough personality in its characters that anyone can easily pick a favorite. But there is an asterisk on that recommendation. Chrono Trigger's brevity and refinement of staple conventions of the genre, while making it a great entry point for this type of game, paradoxically also skews expectations. This isn't Chrono Trigger's fault, of course, it's just a matter of circumstance, but I can see someone playing Chrono Trigger, loving it, wanting to play more games like it, and being disappointed when others like Final Fantasy VI or Dragon Quest V have random encounters, no team attacks, less expressive character animation, and more padding, which brings their play times well above that of Chrono Trigger. For good or for ill, Chrono Trigger is in a league of its own, and it would continue to stand out among the crowd with every re-release. On November 2nd, 1999, just 16 days before the release of its follow-up, Chrono Cross, Chrono Trigger would be re-released for the Sony PlayStation in Japan, with the North American version being bundled with Final Fantasy IV as part of Final Fantasy Chronicles on June 29, 2001. This version, like the PlayStation re-releases of early Final Fantasy titles, would be marred by poor load times, but also sport new pre-rendered FMV cutscenes. However, unlike the PlayStation Final Fantasy re-releases, Chrono Trigger had more than just a couple of CGI scenes bookending the game. Instead, 10 animated cutscenes were produced by Toei Animation to be played at various points in the story. The most significant of these are the two ending FMVs, one of which shows Chrono and Marl's wedding, Glenn becoming a Knight of Guardia in his own time, and Luca adopting an infant she finds in the woods that has a pendant similar to Shala and Marl's. The other shows the fall of Guardia, as a sort of prelude to Chrono Cross. All of these scenes are gorgeously animated, but aside from the opening and ending scenes, they're mostly redundant. Their greatest benefit is helping to give Chrono a bit more personality by showing his reactions to a handful of story events, including his own death. His flashing back to when Janice told him that one of them will die is a nice touch. These FMVs would make a return in the Nintendo DS version of the game released in November 2008 in Japan and North America, and February 2009 in Europe and Australia, marking the first time Chrono Trigger was commercially available in these territories. The DS version also sported some new bonus content, namely a monster battling arena, some repetitive fetch quests, and a new super boss in the form of the Dream Devourer, a form of Lavos which is slowly incorporating Shala into itself, corrupting her. Before the battle begins, the party is met by a future version of Magus, from a timeline where they've already defeated Lavos, and afterward he dedicated his life to finding and saving his sister. After the fight, Shala, in a moment of lucidity, sends the party away, and pleads with her brother that he forget about her and live his own life, as she's no longer herself. She sends him away, and now bereft of purpose, future Magus casts away his memories and sense of self, hoping to begin again. When he awakens in Guardia Forest, he has no memory of who he is, only the feeling that he needed to find someone, and he vows to find out who. Once again, this is meant to tie into Chrono Cross, but taken as part of Chrono Trigger, it's a thematically interesting coda for Magus. It feeds into the existential undercurrent that was in the original story and feels like a natural continuation of his character, even if it means the end of his identity as Magus. The DS version also sports a revised localization by Tom Slattery, who had previously worked on the localizations for Final Fantasy VI Advance, Final Fantasy Tactics: The War of the Lions, and the 3D remake of Final Fantasy IV. But unlike those projects, his work on Chrono Trigger DS was less of a top-down rewrite and more of a refinement of Ted Woolsey's work for the original Super Nintendo release. And the time Slattery was given to finish his work reflected this, leading him to be selective about how he would approach reworking certain aspects of the script and screen text to maintain internal consistency. This version of the game would end up being the basis of a mobile port released in 2011, which in turn would be ported to PC in 2018, but without the monster arena. While this was initially a welcome surprise, as Square Enix had apparently made no announcement of its PC release before dropping it on Steam, this surprise would quickly turn to disappointment when fans realized that it was practically a direct port of the mobile version, with a smeary visual filter that couldn't be disabled and an ill-fitting mobile UI. It was still Chrono Trigger at heart, but this fact wouldn't stop players from leaving a deluge of negative reviews for the port on Steam. Square Enix putting a shoddy mobile port of one of their 16-bit classics on PC was nothing new by this point, as I've brought up in my retrospectives on Final Fantasies V and VI. But unlike those ports, which would remain unchanged for years before the impending release of the Pixel remasters saw them delisted, Square Enix actually responded to the criticisms levied towards their slapdash handling of Chrono Trigger with a series of patches which addressed just about every major issue this version had upon its release, including a new font, cleaner UI, the option to disable the god-awful visual filter to get back those beautifully chunky pixels, and an extras menu where players can listen to the game's soundtrack, look at concept art, watch the different endings they've unlocked, and watch all of the FMVs. However, for reasons unknown, the FMVs where Krona, Luca, and Marl finds the dilapidated Robo in the future, and the fall of Guardia, are absent in this version. Due to time constraints, I wasn't able to play much of this version, so unfortunately I can't comment much on the new script or the overall quality of the new bonus content. I also feel like I couldn't really give a well-informed opinion on the former without having also played Chrono Cross, so maybe that's something to consider for the future. But I can say that, at least in terms of presentation, it's pretty solid in its current state. I'm not particularly fond of there being HP and ATB gauges hovering close to your characters, especially when you still have your HP readouts present in the traditional battle UI anyway, but this is just a minor nitpick. As far as I can tell, the reputation of Chrono Trigger on PC has done almost a complete 180 among fans, with Steam user reviews bouncing back from being almost universally negative to very positive overall. But it certainly helps that Chrono Trigger itself has always garnered a particular sort of acclaim, even upon its original release.
発売。
Right out of the gate, Chrono Trigger was a monumental success in Japan, debuting at the top of the sales charts with over 700,000 copies sold in its first week on store shelves. This success was reflected in both critical and player appraisal, with Famitsu staff rating it an 8 out of 10, and their readers a 9. It would remain in the #1 spot on the Japanese sales charts through March 1995, and would continue to be a mainstay in the top 30 until late July, selling nearly 1.7 million units before dropping off the chart. It would ultimately be the second best-selling game in Japan that year behind Dragon Quest VI, which, despite releasing in December, would sell over 2 million copies. While Chrono Trigger would be acclaimed by critics and players in the West, as it had been in Japan, with GamePro's Scary Larry giving it a perfect score, and Electronic Gaming Monthly's review crew rating it a 37 out of 40, sales-wise, it didn't do nearly as well. Even when accounting for sales of the Final Fantasy Chronicles collection for the PlayStation, which was the #1 best-selling PlayStation title for the first 6 weeks of its availability, Chrono Trigger would only sell about 290,000 copies in North America, across both releases, by March 31st, 2003. Meanwhile, in Japan, it had sold a combined 2.36 million units. The DS version would see comparable sales in North America, with 240,000 units being sold by June 12, 2009. Interestingly, Square Enix seemed to be marketing this re-release specifically towards pre-existing fans of the game, as print ads for the remake simply sported the line, "Good morning, Chrono," on a black page with a release date and URL to www.goodmorningchrono.com. If Tom Slattery had known this was going to happen, then he wouldn't have changed the line in his script to, "Chrono, are you still sleeping?" After the DS release, a combined total of roughly 3.44 million copies of the game had been sold worldwide between all 3 versions. And yet, despite the relatively low turnout in the West, that initial praise continues to persist even to this day. In the September 1995 issue of Next Generation magazine, Chrono Trigger was lauded as one of the best RPGs ever made, despite the uncredited writer's opinion that the game's narrative is a bit light when compared to Final Fantasy VI, and its characters lacking in substantial growth. In May 2011, Lucas M. Thomas, writing for IGN, would give the Wii Virtual Console re-release of the game a perfect 10 out of 10, declaring it to be a, quote, masterpiece, despite whatever improvements may have come with the then recently released iteration for the Nintendo DS. And in 2024, you'll no doubt find it near the top of many best RPGs of all time lists, if not in the #1 spot. And this acclaim often extends even further, from being considered one of the best games in the SNES library to one of the greatest games of all time, full stop. Its popularity isn't exclusive to the West either, as a Famitsu poll conducted in 2019 saw Chrono Trigger declared to be the best game of the Heisei era by a pool of over 7,000 readers, and its influence can still be felt today in games like I Am Setsuna, Chained Echoes, Cosmic Star Heroine, and Sea of Stars. While I won't deny that Chrono Trigger is a great game, I will admit that I'm just a bit perplexed by its monumental status. I've talked with friends, acquaintances, and patrons in my Patreon Discord about why they think Chrono Trigger continues to enjoy such zealous acclaim, and the most common answer I've gotten is nostalgia. But I disagree, as I've also watched videos from and had conversations with several people who only played the game for the first time recently as adults, and have wholeheartedly joined the chorus of adulation, singing its praises and upholding Chrono Trigger as a masterpiece. Sometimes these people proclaim Chrono Trigger to be flawless, perfect even. I knew of this reputation going into Chrono Trigger, but as I said in my general thoughts bonus video on the game, I try to maintain a cautious optimism when going into media that are held in such high esteem. Often I end up agreeing with the praise heaped upon these works, such as with Citizen Kane, Cowboy Bebop, Evangelion, Half-Life, and Final Fantasy VI. Other times I don't, but still end up liking it well enough, like with Disney's Beauty and the Beast, Spirited Away, and, most recently, Chrono Trigger. Like I said earlier, maybe it's just a matter of taste for me. But then one of my Twitter followers, Greg Troyan, replied to one of my tweets with something which hadn't crossed my mind but made a lot of sense. He said that there seems to be two kinds of people: Chrono Trigger fans and Final Fantasy VI fans. There are those who like both, of course, but someone's preference between them can often clue you in on what they value in art. With that in mind, I am clearly a Final Fantasy VI person, though I'm sure that was pretty obvious. But regarding what either of them may suggest about one's preferences in art and media, well, I think that's a different discussion entirely, best saved for another day. If you think Chrono Trigger is a masterpiece, that's fine. If you're disheartened that I don't think the same, then I'm sorry that I think it's only pretty good. But now that I have Chrono Trigger under my belt, I've become much more interested in its heavily divisive sequel. But that will have to wait for another time.